The wood on the porch steps had rotted through in 2 places. I found that out the hard way, my right foot punching through the second step, splinters scraping my ankle as I caught myself on the railing. The railing groaned but held. I stood there for a moment, half in and half out of that broken step, my hand pressed flat against my stomach, and I thought, this is what my life looks like now. 24 hours ago, I was choosing centerpieces. My grandmother's house sat at the end of a dirt road in rural Tennessee, about 11 miles outside of a town so small it didn't have a stoplight. She had passed 4 years earlier and left the property to me, the only grandchild who ever actually visited. My mother thought the house was an embarrassment. My ex-fiancé, Daniel, had never once asked to see it. I had driven 6 hours with a single suitcase, a purse with $43 in it, and a baby the size of a lemon growing somewhere behind my navel. The key was still under the same ceramic frog by the door. My grandmother had thought that was very clever. I had never told her it was the first place anyone would look. Inside, the air was thick and stale and smelled like old paper, and something floral, her perfume, maybe, absorbed so deeply into the curtains that even 4 years couldn't shake it loose. I stood in the doorway and breathed it in and did not cry. I had done enough crying on the highway. I had pulled over somewhere around the Kentucky border and sat in a gas station parking lot for 40 minutes, hazard lights blinking, until a truck driver knocked on my window to ask if I needed help. I told him I was fine. He didn't look convinced. I drove the rest of the way without stopping. The electricity was off. Of course it was. I found candles in the kitchen drawer. My grandmother had kept them for storms, and lit 3 of them, and set them on the kitchen table, and sat down in the chair that had always been hers. I had been engaged for 8 months. I had been secretly married for 3. That part requires explaining, because I know how it sounds. I know it sounds like I was hiding something. In a way, Daniel had been the one hiding things, and the marriage had been his idea, not mine, which is the kind of sentence that only makes sense once you understand who Daniel actually was. I met him when I was 28. He was a corporate attorney at a firm downtown, the kind of man who had strong opinions about wine and wore his watch on the right wrist because he said it kept the face cleaner. He was charming in the specific way that very controlled people are charming, everything carefully measured, everything deployed at exactly the right moment. I mistook that for confidence. Most people do, at first. We dated for a year before he proposed. The ring was beautiful. The proposal was public, a restaurant, his friends watching from a table nearby, a photographer he had hired without telling me. I smiled for the photos because what else do you do? I said yes because I loved him, or I thought I did, or I thought what I felt was love because I didn't yet have a good reference point. His family was old Southern money, the kind that had opinions about everything and expressed them as facts. His mother, from the first dinner, had looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture that doesn't quite match the room. I was a kindergarten teacher from a family that shopped at discount grocery stores. I was not what she had pictured. 3 months after the engagement, Daniel came to me with a proposal inside the proposal. His grandmother, the one who actually controlled the family trust, had a clause in her estate documents. Married grandchildren received their inheritance distributions directly. Unmarried grandchildren had theirs managed by a family committee, which in practice meant his mother. He was 34 years old and did not want his mother deciding what he did with his money. It would just be a civil ceremony, he said, a formality. We're getting married anyway in October. This just moves the legal part up. Why not tell your family? I asked. He had an answer ready. He said his grandmother's health was declining, and he didn't want the drama of a second celebration to overshadow the wedding we had already planned. He said his mother would make it about herself. He said it was simpler this way. I believed him. I want to be honest about that. I was not naive. I was a grown woman with a job and a lease and a 401k. But I loved him, and the explanation was plausible, and I thought the secret would only last until October. We signed the papers at the county clerk's office on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 colleagues of his served as witnesses. I wore a blue dress I already owned. He took me to dinner afterward at the restaurant where he had proposed, and he was warm and funny and attentive in a way that he sometimes wasn't, and I remember thinking that this was going to be a good marriage. That was March. By June, I was pregnant. I hadn't planned it. We had been careful, and then 1 month we weren't. And then I was standing in the bathroom of my school during lunch, holding a test and trying to remember how to breathe. I sat with it for 2 days before I told him. I rehearsed what I was going to say. I thought about the October wedding, the guest list, whether we'd need to tell people sooner than we'd planned. He was quiet for a long time after I told him. How far along? He asked. 6 weeks. Maybe 7. I have an appointment Thursday. He nodded slowly. He was looking at the kitchen counter, not at me. Is it mine? He said. I heard the words. I processed them. And then I said, very carefully, what? I'm asking if it's mine. There was something in his voice that I had never heard before. Not anger exactly, something colder than anger. Something that had been waiting. Of course it's yours, I said. What kind of question is that? He looked at me then, and his face was the face of a man who had already made a decision. I've been hearing things, he said, about you and someone at your school. I won't write out the whole conversation because some of it I still don't fully understand. The person at my school was a colleague, someone I had lunch with occasionally. Someone who was engaged to someone else, someone I had never so much as touched. Daniel had a friend whose wife worked in our district's administrative office. That friend had apparently told him that this colleague and I were close. That was the entirety of the evidence. That was what he had built his conclusion on. I told him all of this. I told him it was not true. I told him I could prove it was not true. He looked at me with that cold, settled face, and I understood, somewhere underneath the shock and the hurt, that the truth was not the point. He had decided something, and the accusation was just the mechanism. I need you to leave, he said. Daniel, I'm pregnant. I need you to leave tonight. I packed what fit in one suitcase. I left my key on the counter. I did not give him back the engagement ring, because the engagement ring was not the only ring I was wearing, and I was done giving things back to him. I drove to a hotel and sat on the bed and called my best friend, who said things I needed to hear. I called my mother, who said things I did not need to hear. I lay on top of the covers with my shoes still on, and stared at the ceiling until it was almost 3 a.m, and then I thought about my grandmother's house, and I thought, I own something. It isn't much, but it is mine. I checked out at 6 and drove south. The first 2 days in the house, I focused on the immediate problems. There was a propane camp stove in the shed that still had fuel in it. I used it to boil water. I found canned goods in the pantry. My grandmother had been a serious believer in preparedness, and ate soup heated in a pot balanced carefully over the blue flame. I had a sleeping bag in my car from a camping trip 2 years ago that I had never unloaded. I slept on the living room couch because the beds upstairs felt too far away from the door. My cell service was weak but workable if I stood near the east-facing windows. I had driven past a dollar store about 3 miles back on the main road. On the 3rd morning I drove there and bought bottled water, more candles, crackers, peanut butter, a cheap phone charger that actually fit my phone, and a local paper because I was looking for one specific thing, the name of a utility company. I had taught myself years ago that when you don't know what to do, you make a list of the smallest possible next steps, not fix my life, not figure out what comes next. Just call the electric company. Find out what it costs to turn the power on. Find out if the account is still somehow in my grandmother's name. It was, and apparently no one had formally closed it, which meant I could transfer it with documentation proving I was the heir, which I had because my grandmother had been organized in that particular way of people who have seen what happens when paperwork isn't in order. By the end of the week, the lights came on. I stood in the kitchen and flipped the switch, and the overhead light flickered and held, and I sat down on the floor and cried in a way that was more relief than grief, though there was grief in it too. My friend from back home, her name is Renata, and she had driven down on the weekend to check on me, bringing a box of groceries, and her very uncomplicated love sat down on the floor next to me and didn't say anything. Sometimes that is exactly the right thing. I'm legally married to him, I told her after a while. She already knew. I had told her on the phone. Have you talked to anyone? A lawyer? Not yet. You need to. She was right. I had been avoiding it because a lawyer made it real in a way that candles and canned soup somehow hadn't. My grandmother's neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Ruth, who had known my grandmother for 40 years, and who appeared on my porch one morning with a casserole dish, and no particular explanation, turned out to be the person who changed everything. Not in a dramatic way, in the slow, accumulating way that actually matters. She knew a lawyer in town. She had used him for her own husband's estate. She made the call herself and explained my situation in the frank, no-nonsense way of a woman who has been summarizing complicated things for decades. His name was Gerald. He had an office above the hardware store and a handshake that meant something. I brought every document I had. The marriage certificate, the engagement announcement, which Daniel had posted on social media and which I had screenshot before he quietly removed it. The lease on his apartment, which I was technically co-signed on. Bank statements for our joint account, which I had opened on my phone the morning after he told me to leave, and screenshot every page before he could move anything. I had also, in those long quiet evenings at my grandmother's kitchen table with Renata's borrowed laptop, found something I hadn't been looking for. Daniel had a business, a consulting LLC registered in a state neither of us lived in. I found it because I was looking up his firm's website out of an old habit, the same way you keep touching a bruise. And there was his name, listed as a principal of a separate entity in a sidebar I almost didn't click. The LLC had a registered agent address. It had a website with very little on it. It had, according to a corporate registry I found after 2 hours of searching, assets filed in quarterly reports that were significantly larger than anything a part-time consulting arrangement would produce. I didn't know what it meant. I took very careful screenshots of everything, numbered them in a document, and brought the document to Gerald. Gerald looked at it for a long time. Did you know about this entity? He asked. No. Did you have any financial relationship with it? No. He looked at it a little longer. This is relevant, he said. Gerald filed the divorce petition in the county where we had legally married, which was not the county where Daniel lived, which created a complication for Daniel's attorneys that Gerald had apparently anticipated. Daniel's first response, through his lawyer, was to deny the marriage was valid, a position that collapsed fairly quickly when presented with a certified copy of the marriage certificate signed by the county clerk. His second response was to claim I had been unfaithful and that the pregnancy was not his. Gerald had told me this was likely. He had also told me to get a paternity test as soon as it was medically appropriate, and I had, because I wanted it on record, not because I had any doubt. The results came back 11 weeks later. The baby was Daniel's. His attorney went quiet on that particular line of argument after that. What took longer was the financial discovery. The LLC was a holding company. Gerald explained a structure Daniel had built to shield assets from his own family's oversight, which was ironic given that I was now the family member he had failed to account for. Under our state's marital property laws, assets accumulated during the marriage, including the growth of that LLC during the 3 months we were legally married, were subject to equitable distribution. It was not a windfall. I want to be honest about that, because stories that end in dramatic windfalls are satisfying but often not true. What I received was fair. It was enough to pay off the remaining balance on my car, put money aside for medical costs, and this was the part that still sometimes catches me sideways when I think about it: repair and restore my grandmother's house properly. I hired a local contractor. I had the porch steps fixed first. I was 7 months pregnant when the settlement was finalized. I was sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table. My kitchen table with a cup of decaf tea and the late afternoon light coming through the window she had always kept facing the garden, and Gerald called to confirm the papers had been signed. I said thank you and hung up and sat there for a while. Ruth came over that evening. She brought pie, which she did regularly, and which I had stopped pretending to discourage. We sat on the porch, the repaired porch, with new boards that were still pale and bright compared to the old weathered ones, and I told her it was done. She nodded like she had already known it would go that way. Your grandmother would have been angry on your behalf, she said, and then she would have been practical about it. That sounds right, I said. She was always practical. She was, I said. I think that's what I'm trying to be. My daughter was born on a Tuesday in November, in the hospital 20 minutes from the house, with Renata in the room because that was what I wanted. She had a round face and strong opinions about sleeping, which she expressed constantly and loudly. I named her after my grandmother, her middle name, not her first, because my grandmother always said she thought her first name was a little old-fashioned, even for her. Daniel did not contest paternity once it was established, which meant he was legally her father, which meant there were conversations still ahead about child support and visitation that I was not naive enough to think would be simple. Gerald was helping with that too. I was taking it one step at a time. The porch swing had been in pieces in the shed. My grandmother had taken it down years ago, when one of the chains rusted through, and she hadn't gotten around to rehanging it. I found the pieces in January, when my daughter was 2 months old and sleeping in a rented bassinet in the bedroom that had been my grandmother's. I couldn't reattach it that day or that week. But in February, on an afternoon when the Tennessee cold had softened just slightly and the light was the kind of thin, pale gold that feels like a promise, I carried the pieces out one at a time and figured out the chains and hung it back where it had always been. I sat on it carefully. It held. I pushed off with one foot and it moved, slow and even, the chains making the small sound I remembered from childhood when I would sit out here with my grandmother in the evenings, and she would tell me things she said she didn't tell anyone else. I don't know if that was true, but I believed her, the way you believe things told to you on a porch swing in the late summer. My daughter was asleep inside. Renata was there, visiting for the week. Ruth had brought over a pot of soup that morning and left it on the stove with a note about reheating time. I thought about what my life looked like now compared to what I had believed it was going to look like. I had believed in something that was partially constructed, carefully managed, presented to me in good lighting. What I had instead was a house that had needed work and now mostly didn't. A neighbor who showed up with casseroles. A friend who drove 6 hours without being asked. A baby who was currently, miraculously, asleep. It was not what I had planned. It was, I was starting to understand, mine in a way that the other life never quite was. The swing moved. The chain settled. Somewhere inside the house, my daughter made a small sound, and then was quiet again. I stayed on the porch until the light changed.